Hubarin ang takot sa iyong damdamin, ipamalas ang angking galing.
Tumayo mong tapang harapin ng buhay, yakapin ang tagumpay.
Tulungan ang kapwa't bigyang halaga, huwag hatakin ng pababa.
Isipin wag sana ang sarili lang, pakisama't bayanihan.
Subukan nating isulong at ligawan ang magandang bukas.
Ikaw at ako magkasama tayo,
Salubungin ang kinabukasan.
Dakila ang lahi ko, bayaning Pilipino, sa makagbago panahon. mandirigmang Pilipino, dakila ang lahi ko, bayaning Pilipino sa makabagong panahon.
Quincentennial Commemorations in the Philippines. On this day, exactly 200 years ago, Jose Felipe Del-Pan was born in A Coruña, Galicia, Spain. He may not be a Filipino by blood, but he was definitely Filipino by heart. The NQC became interested to this figure in Philippine history because of his immense influence to a generation of Filipinos like Rizal, who eventually studied Philippine history, culture, and society using the materials he gathered and made available to the general public in the second half of the 19th century. We are now live in various Facebook pages, primarily on National Quincentennial Committee and the National Historical Commission of the Philippines. This event is also live via Facebook pages of the Department of Foreign Affairs, Department of Education, the National Commission for Culture and the Arts, and Instituto Cervantes. Highlight of our event today is the book launching of Dr. and one of the commissioners of the NHCP, Dr. Lino Dizon, titled Nascent Philippine Studies in the Life and Labor of Jose Felipe Del-Pan, 1821 to 1891. And to those who wish to join in the discussion, the webinar link is still open. Kindly check the comment box of the NQC page for the link. Then this will enable you to directly ask questions to our author and the three reviewers of the book that we are launching today. And to begin with, may we call on the chairperson of the National Historical Commission of the Philippines and concurrently the executive director of the National Quincentennial Committee, Dr. Rene R. Escalante, for his opening message.
Ian, can you turn on my video? Ian, can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Sir, you're now...
Okay, thank you. Thank you for turning on the video. On behalf of the National Historical Commission and then the National Quincentennial Committee, I would like to welcome all of you in this book launching of my good friend, Dr. Lino Dizon. Last April 8, President Rodrigo Roa Duterte signed Proclamation number 1128, declaring 2021 as the year of the Filipino pre-colonial ancestors. The issuance mandates the National Quincentennial Committee, or NQC, to lead the observance. That is why the committee, in close partnership with the National Historical Commission of the Philippines, adopted the birth milestones of two significant personalities who contributed in the development and progress of Filipino understanding of the world of our pre-colonial ancestors. The first one is the 200th birth anniversary of Jose Felipe Del-Pan, which we commemorate today. And the second is the 100th birth anniversary of William Henry Scott, which will be on July 10 of this year. Del-Pan was a Spaniard by birth, while Scott is an American. But definitely, they were Filipinos at heart, as they loved everything that is Filipino. Today, we mark the birth bicentenary of Del-Pan through this online academic gathering with the launching of the book, Nascent Philippine Studies in the Life and Labor of Jose Felipe Del-Pan, 1821 to 1891, by my fellow commissioner at NHCP and a good friend, Dr. Lino Dizon. This book was published by NHCP in solidarity with the 2021 Quincentennial Commemorations. Let me extend my greetings to the reviewers and other speakers in this book review, particularly eminent Philippine historian and mentor of Dr. Dizon back in the UP Diliman, Dr. Jaime Veneracion, my colleague in the De La Salle University History Department, Dr. Jose Victor Torres, and also to Professor Jorge Mojarro, the University of Santo Tomas. And this morning, we are also joined by another good friend, the Director of the Instituto Cervantes de Manila, Dr. Javier Galban. Thank you very much for responding to our invitation, and thank you also for taking time to join us virtually in this book launching. The theme we prepared for the celebration of Del-Pan's birth bicentenary is Nuestro Inolvidable Maestro, Jose Felipe Del-Pan. It means our unforgettable teacher, Jose Felipe Del-Pan. Derived from how patriot and scholar Isabelo de los Reyes eulogized Del-Pan as his mentor, while a young staff of Del-Pan's newspaper, La Oceana Española. We chose this theme to emphasize how Del-Pan inspired the rise of Filipino scholars in the generations of De los Reyes and Jose Rizal, whom the Filipino people regard as national heroes and the ones who defined the Filipino nation. Rizal himself told Ferdinand Blumentritt that Del-Pan was his friend, while De los Reyes acknowledged Del-Pan for telling him not to procrastinate and begin, and I quote, writing articles on folklore or popular knowledge, and also of collecting such stories from old women and maids. To De los Reyes, the Spaniard from Galicia taught the Filipinos to wake up from all our dreams and ambitions of being so absorbed in entertainment and discover the Filipino. Once again, may I extend my utmost gratitude to Dr. Lino Dizon, because if not of his dissertation in UP Diliman on Del-Pan, we would not have known his immense influence in our understanding of being and becoming a Filipino. On behalf of the NQC and NHCP, I welcome you all to this humble online event, and may all of us be mentors to others in our respective way. Thank you very much, and let us keep safe always.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rene Escalante, for the overview of our event today. He detailed to us the connection of the 2021 Quincentennial Commemorations in the Philippines and the bicentenary of Jose Felipe Del-Pan's birth. And just to add, supposedly there will be a historical marker to be unveiled today, but it is deferred to some other date. And hopefully this will be unveiled this year. And the location of the historical marker in honor of Jose Felipe Del-Pan will be at Intramuros in Manila. And this book by the National Historical Commission of the Philippines that that we will be launching in a while is actually the second reprinting. The first printing of this was under the auspices of the Center for Tarlaqueño Studies of Tarlac State University, from which Dr. Dizon was formerly the director. And it was published through the aid of the Spanish Program for Cultural Cooperation in 2009. When it was launched in 2010 at the Center for Kapampangan Studies in Holy Angel University in Angeles City, I was actually a researcher and also one of the mentee of Dr. Dizon. And present in that event were the delegations from the Spanish Embassy and also by the Instituto Cervantes de Manila, then headed by Don Pepe Rodriguez. And we are now fortunate to have also the director of the Instituto Cervantes de Manila to give us his message on behalf of the Spanish Embassy in the Philippines. Let me call on Director Javier Galpan, Director of the Instituto Cervantes de Manila.
Buenos días a todos, magandang umaga sa inyong lahat. First of all, I want to congratulate to Dr. Lino Dizon for this very important contribution to remember an important person in the history of the Philippines and in the history of Spain, in our shared history. Also to acknowledge, as our MC today, researcher Ian Alfonso has mentioned, to Tarlac State University for the first edition of this book. That brings me to the memory this Spanish program for cultural cooperation. There was a very important program from the Spanish Ministry of Culture. The partner those days, the beginning of this program was Ateneo de Manila University, and in a particular moment was Instituto Cervantes managing this program. Myself was the director at that time, at my first stage in the Philippines. And a number of very interesting studies on the shared history were published thanks to that program. So we have to find a way to come again with a similar program. I think that if there are possibilities, and why not? We can work together with National Historical Commission of the Philippines and with the Spanish Ministry of Culture to have the possibility to shed light on aspects on our common history that are there, somehow hidden. And thanks to this program will be possible that Filipino and Spanish researchers bring to the surface these important persons and important events and institutions of the common history. Of course, I want to thank to the chairman, my dear friend René Escalante, and to the National Historical Commission of the Philippines for inviting us to share this important event, online event. It's a pleasure always to work together, to make things together. And I want also to say hello to our followers in Facebook. We are reproducing by streaming in the Instituto Cervantes Facebook page. Of course, to congratulate also to all the speakers and reviewers, some of them good friends from old days. And I won't talk about Felipe Del-Pan. I'm not a specialist on this part of the history, and of course there are persons with a great knowledge on him, and they will talk about this important figure of the past. No? But yes, I would like to underline the human aspect, the human touch, no? Because somehow in Jose Felipe Del-Pan we recognize ourselves. I have to say that myself, and in a humble way, and also the speaker that will talk to you later, Professor Dr. Jorge Mojarro, we represent Spaniards that were taken by the Philippines. For some reason, we arrived in the Philippines. We didn't know that much the country. We came in an early age, and our lives changed completely. So that was the case of Del-Pan, and of course, as it has been said, he was not Filipino by birth, but Filipino by heart, and he became actually Filipino. And I like to call these people like himself that they were as Spaniards as Filipinos. And that happened with a number, an important number of persons throughout the history, you know. So I like also to quote Julio Palacios. Julio Palacios was an eminent physician that came to give lectures in the Philippines almost, well, about 100 years ago. And he wrote a book on that tour of lectures, especially in the Philippines. Well, the title, maybe today, titles are very different, no? But the title of the book is "The Philippines Proud of Spain," no? Pride of Spain, the Philippines Pride of Spain, no? But actually, that book is written with very much love for the Philippines, and Julio Palacios was only visiting the Philippines, and he said something about another Spaniard that he found here, Garcia Sanchez. He said something that touched me very much when I read it. Said, in the Philippines, he found himself. Notice what deep is this statement. But that's very true, and we can apply that for sure to Felipe Del-Pan. If not for the Philippines, well, Jose Felipe Del-Pan would have come back probably to Spain, to Galicia, to La Coruña. We don't know about what would have been his life if not for the Philippines. But actually, he is in the history because of his passage to the Philippines, because his life in the Philippines, and actually he created a family, a Filipino family of nowadays. So that also shows a period of history important that I think that has to be somehow reviewed with a different eyes. Somehow many scholars look at Spain as a madre patria, as the mother of a well-young country or something like that. I think that is a wrong appreciation. The Spain of nowadays is a Spain also that was coming into a new reality starting in 19th century. So we can say that the Spain of nowadays is as the Philippines, as the republics of Latin America. They are heirs, they are sisters, we can say, or daughters of that Spanish monarchy. It was the entity, the political entity that created that empire. But we are at the same level, the Spain of today, the Philippines of today, and the other republics of Hispanic origin, as are the Latin American republics. So Del-Pan loved the Philippines. Del-Pan started somehow the Philippine studies in a modern way. We don't have to ignore all those missionaries that started to study the languages and created the first dictionaries of Filipino languages. No? So that's why, and I'm finishing already, Del-Pan was such an important figure because represents this love between Spain and the Philippines, represents many of Spanish people that found in the Philippines the sense of their lives, and also because shed light on the interest on Filipino studies. And actually, Instituto Cervantes, as promoting Spanish language and Spanish culture, owes very much to figures like Jose Felipe Del-Pan. Well, thank you very much again for this opportunity to be here this morning. Thank you to National Historical Commission of the Philippines. We will continue working together, of course. And congratulations to Dr. Lino Dizon for this very important contribution of our common history. Muchas gracias. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you very much, Director Javier Galvan of the Instituto Cervantes de Manila. For us to have an idea who Jose Felipe Del-Pan was, may I request my colleague Alec Heradilla to kindly share the brief audiovisual presentation for in honor of the birthday celebrant today, Jose Felipe Del-Pan. So it's just a 3-minute short ABP. It will mark the start of the book launching of Dr. Lino Dizon's book, Nascent Philippine Studies in the Life and Labor of Jose Felipe Del-Pan, 1821 to 1891.
We have ascribed to the reform movement the notion that they initiated the interest of Filipinos to discover their ancestry, heritage, and history. However, it was a Spaniard who lighted the spark to fuel this passion, Jose Felipe Del-Pan. Born in Galicia, Spain, Del-Pan reached the Philippines in 1855 to serve the Spanish colonial government. He married Amalia Fontella, a mestiza Filipina, and since then stayed in the Philippines and became fascinated by everything Filipino and Philippine. He wrote about our forebears and their past with the utmost regard. He also visited various provinces to document the values, customs, and traditions. When he was named editor of Imprenta de Ramirez y Guadier, one of the prolific printing establishments in the archipelago, he instigated the reprinting of classic sources on Filipino identity and history. These materials, along with his cultural and historical documentation, became available to a new generation of Filipino scholars who furthered the burgeoning of Philippine studies. He even mentored some of these scholars who became championed authorities of Filipino heritage. When Del-Pan died in 1891, people thronged his funeral. His own countrymen celebrated him as their dean of the Philippine press. But our heroes remembered him as a friend, second father, and an unforgettable teacher. It is for these reasons that the National Quincentennial Committee has adopted the commemoration of Del-Pan's birth bicentenary this 2021. The National Historical Commission of the Philippines pays tribute to him through a historical marker and the reprinting of Dr. Lino Dizon's book, Nascent Philippine Studies in the Life and Labor of Jose Felipe Del-Pan, 1821 to 1891. Let us embrace Del-Pan's wisdom to avoid procrastination and to start writing articles on folklore or popular knowledge and to collect stories from old folks. We have ascribed to
And that's the brief audiovisual presentation on Jose Felipe Del-Pan and the book Nascent Philippine Studies in the Life and Labor of Jose Felipe Del-Pan, 1821 to 1891, by NHCP Commissioner Dr. Lino L. Dizon, to give us the first of the 3 reviews to the book. May I introduce first the one of the reviewers. He is a full professor at the History Department of De La Salle University, Manila. He is also Associate Director for Drama and History at the Bienvenido and Santos Creative Writing Center in the same university. He has a PhD and MA in History from the University of Santo Tomas Graduate School. A multi-awarded playwright and essayist, his book Ciudad Murada, A Walk Through Historic Intramuros by Bibal Publishing, won the National Book Award for Travel Writing in 2006 and in 2017. His collection of essays titled To the Person Sitting in Darkness and Other Footnotes in Philippine History by the University of Santo Tomas Publishing House was awarded the National Book Award for Essays in English. He is the author and editor of books on Philippine history and culture and a contributor of articles on history and culture to local magazines and journals. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Jose Victor Zarcal Torres.
Hi, thank you, Ian, for that nice and flattering introduction. And good morning to everyone, to Chairman Escalante, Dr. Galvan, and my colleagues in education history, Professor Jorge and Lino, and of course, Earl, I'm glad to see you again. And of course, my a good friend who I frequently see, but whenever we see, nagchichismisan kami ng mahaba, Dr. Lino Dizon. I was given the first space here to review Dr. Dizon's book, and I must say that it is something that I have long anticipated for quite a while because I was already familiar with the book. I already saw it before when it was first came out, when it was published by the Center for Talaqueño Studies. And probably, I remember this was like a colored yellow or a beige book, no, with the photograph of Del-Pan on the cover. And the probably the first and only copy that I saw was found in the Solidaridad bookshop. And it was very, very unfortunate for me that I hesitated in buying it because I was just a government employee at that time, and books were quite, for me, a luxury in buying. And when I came back for it, it was no longer there. So when I saw Lino again, that was around 6 months later, I asked him, do you still have a copy of your Del-Pan book? Because I think that is the only copy of your book that I don't have yet. And then, of course, Lino told me, well, sorry, that was only published in a very limited way, in a limited edition. So I am glad that this was reprinted by the National Historical Commission to the Philippines. And, of course, congratulations again to Lino. Okay. The book came at a very auspicious time because I just delivered a lecture several weeks before, no, so over a week before, under the NHCP also, with on the importance of Mariano Ponce and his contribution to Philippine cultural studies. And there was always one question that hung over my study in reading Mariano Ponce, and eventually this question always also extend to Jose Rizal. Why did their ideas suddenly change when um, when they were fighting for equality with Spain in the reform movement? At first, they were fighting for equality, but because of the problems that they were encountering with regards to realizing the question of being equal to their to fellow Spaniards, Rizal would eventually change his mind and say, of course, indeed, we are not equal. The Filipino culture is unique, and the Filipino culture should be promoted. And that question always put to me, what changed Rizal's mind? Why did all of a sudden he would bring this about? I found the answer in Lino's book because it was with the beginnings of the nationalist studies of Philippine culture by Jose Felipe Del-Pan that his influence in realizing the study of Philippine culture and culture history and the arts would prove to be a very great
significance. That's why I was so attracted at first by the title. The title, of course, is Nascent Philippine Studies, which is technically the beginning. At that time, Philippine Studies wasn't that unknown, but it was focused more on the studies by Spanish writers. Yet here was Del-Pan, a Spanish writer, writing about the culture, the environment, the people of a country that he was living in. The question that hung over my head was slowly being answered. Okay. That the articles that he would eventually write, the newspapers that he eventually would put out, would bring to mind now of the importance then and today of how identity forms part of who we are in confronting our foreign, our local and foreign crises and other problems. My second encounter with Jose Felipe Del-Pan, was when I published, when I was writing my history of the Philippine press. Okay? This was mentioned to me by Gus Vibal, and Mr. Vibal would tell me, you should include Jose Felipe Del-Pan. Sabi ko, why? Sabi ko, was it a Spaniard? Sabi niya, no. Jose Felipe Del-Pan began something at that time that wasn't even considered in the Philippines before. And this was an intellectual revolution, a change in the environment of the Philippines that would bring about the new ideas that would be confronting Filipinos now. And these ideas, as given by the Dean of the Philippine Press, as he would become later known, influenced a lot of writers. Don Belong, De Los Reyes, Mariano Ponce, and of course, Pascual Poblete. I was talking to Mr. Rombeto Campo yesterday, and we were discussing a short time about the book. And I told him, can you realize the irony? No? That Jose Felipe Del-Pan was already looking and finding Philippine culture in the Philippines because he was here, while Rizal was still looking for the materials for Philippine culture in Europe. He was, of course, familiar already with the Filippinologists and everything, but his study would at first probably be yung sinasabi natin sa Filipino ay nangangapa, but it eventually would be developed and eventually be found with the works, of course, of Del-Pan, whom he mentions in his letters to his fellow reformists. The book is interesting. I'm not going to press talk about it if it's not interesting, but the academic work is very impressive. I've always known Lino to be very precise and very concise in his research work. Yeah? And I would actually tell fellow historians who would look at the studies of the Philippine Reform Movement or the reformist movement and the study of Philippine journalism and the study of Philippine culture to bring this book and make this book as part of their library. I would probably end my short review with these words, and I presented this letter before in my lecture on Mariano Ponce. This was a letter that Jose Rizal wrote to Marcelo del Pilar in 1889, while he was already doing his research at the British Museum in London. Of course, he was researching Philippine culture now. The interesting thing about the letter was that on the last part, as a form of farewell to to Marcelo del Pilar, Rizal was referring to a lecture and a book that was being written by Del Pilar about the reform movement, where he still talked about equality. Rizal in 1889 already was changing his mind about equality, and he wrote these final words, no, not for me, would later create the rift between Del Pilar and Rizal. Rizal wrote, "You are writing for Spain. I am writing for the Filipinos." And I'm sure that is also the very same thing that came to mind when Jose Felipe Del-Pan began his work in the Philippines. Thank you very much for the opportunity to review this book, the NHCP, and I hope that you buy the book. I'm not this is like a marketing scheme. I hope you buy the book to learn and realize how much our culture was that important to us even before. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jose Victor Torres, for the introductory review to the book of Dr. Lino Dizon. And before I proceed to our next reviewer, may I invite our friends in the webinar and also those watching online to kindly comment your questions if you have questions about who Felipe Del-Pan was, and we will collect them and do our best to raise them uh, right after the author's remarks in the latter part of this event. And also, Dr. Vic Torres mentioned. So I forgot to announce that the book is already on sale. So uh, you can order this via NHCP. You may drop by the Historical Commission of the Philippines building in Ermita, Manila, or email us at records.nhcp.gov.ph. The book costs 300 pesos only. So please support this remarkable book. This is the second of the several quincentennial publications in our pipeline. So the first one was launched in Cebu last April, and it is authored by no less than food culinary historian Feliz Prudente Santa Maria, titled Pigafetta's Philippine Picnic. And then this is the second one, the book on Jose Felipe Del-Pan. And in the coming days, we will announce the third book under the quincentennial titles. You know? So, okay, so the book, magkakahalaga po ang book ng 300 pesos, and kindly email us at records.nhcp.gov.ph. May I also acknowledge our guests here in our webinar. So we are joined here by uh, our Deputy Executive Director for Programs and Projects, Mr. Alvin R. Alcid. We are also here with us also is the Secretariat Head of the National Quincentennial Committee, Architect Reynaldo Lita, the Chief of the Historic Sites and Education Division of the NHCP, Ma'am Gina Batuhan, and Ma'am Paulita Avestruz. And then a while ago, he's still here. One of the commissioners of the NHCP from the Visayas, Dr. Earl Jude Paul Cleope from the Silliman University. And to introduce, and may I introduce the second reviewer. He obtained his Master of Spanish Philology in Universidad de Sevilla and his doctorate on Spanish and Latin American literature at the Universidad de Salamanca. He teaches literature at the University of Santo Tomas and is a full-time professor of Spanish at Instituto Cervantes de Manila. He has been awarded fellowships by the University of Santo Tomas, the Lilly Library of the University of Indiana, and Huntington Library in California. His areas of research are Philippine colonial literature, Philippine literature in Spanish and history of the book in the Philippines. His most recent book is the compilation titled More Hispanic Than We Admit, Volume 3, by Bival Pub Foundation in 2020. He keeps a weekly column in the Manila Times named The Filipiniana Corner. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Jorge Mojaro.
Good morning, everybody. First, I want to send my regards to Dr. Vic Torres, to Dr. René Escalante, and of course, I want to congratulate the author, Dr. Lino Lizon. I want to say that actually I was one of the lucky ones who were able to read this book when it was first published in 2009. And so I got a copy, and I was recently arrived to the Philippines. I arrived to the Philippines in September 2009, just 2 weeks before Typhoon Ondoy. And this is one of the first books I read about Philippine studies. And since I'm a literary scholar, I would like to focus, especially in the chapter 5, which deals with the literary works of Del-Pan. The first thing I would like to point out is that actually his novels, or short stories or novellas, no, because some of the novels are not too long, were not mediocre. It's not that I know that the Retana was exceedingly harsh to him, and then Hernandez Chung also follows the path of Retana. But I have read some of those novels, a few, like 2 or 3, because I found them in the library of the Augustinians in Valladolid. I think they have the full collection of literary works when they were published in volumes. And actually, you can say that those novels are actually average or typical from the second half of 19th century. But there is no way to say that those novels were bad. And actually, those novels are very interesting because they actually portray Philippine society, both in Manila and also in the provinces, in a very interesting way. One of the most important things and to consider about Jose Felipe Del-Pan is that, as I have said in other articles, is that Jose Rizal did not appear spontaneously.
This meeting is being recorded. The recording has stopped.
Jose Rizal did not appear spontaneously. I mean, there was a cultural context. There was a rich, there was a big amount of publications. There was a lot of newspapers, cultural newspapers, no? And in that sense, I think Jose Felipe Del-Pan did a great contribution, and this book actually talks a lot about that. I mean, Jose Felipe Del-Pan is what we would consider today like a cultural agent. No, it's not. He was a person who was really concerned about the possibilities of the Philippines and how strengthening Philippine studies would have a very positive outcome for the country. And the book talks a lot about Revista de Filipinas, yes, where there are, by the first time, we can find articles about geology, volcanology, ethnographic studies, etc., etc. So in that sense, Jose Felipe Del-Pan was a pioneer. But if we move again about, and we talk again about literature, it's not only that his contributions were really interesting, I mean, his own creations. One of the things that actually this book does not talk about, probably because it's out of the scope, it's out of the goals of the book, is that how important were translations in La Oceanía Española, no? That newspapers that he was directing. For example, I have found that thanks to the intermediation of Jose Felipe Del-Pan, we found the first translations of Shakespeare published in the Philippines. I found that at least, for example, The Merchant of Venice was published in the Philippines in 1890, I think, 1890. And also, the same year was also published Richard III by Shakespeare. He also translated French literature. I have found translations from Alphonse Daudet. He also promoted the translation of Longfellow, which is a very fine poet from UK. I found translations from German authors, from French authors, from Italian authors, translations of crime writers like Arthur Conan Doyle. So that is a very important. It's an important thing. His goal, his role as an intermediator, that he promoted the publication of literary translations in La Oceanía Española. Later on, those translations were published independently as books, right? But in that sense, he contributed a lot to the development of literature in the country. Also, we have to take in consideration, for example, the first novel published by a Filipino, which was Ninay. I think we should, for example, compare Ninay by Pedro Paterno with Un idilio entre Sampaguitas, no? Because, for example, they both display a very idealized society and a very idealized nature in the provinces, no? And there are a lot of connections between Jose Felipe Del-Pan and other important Filipino writers like Isabel de los Reyes, Jose Rizal, Pedro Paterno, and I think those connections have not been recognized. In that sense, I think this book is very important because it establishes where we can find one of the seeds of that, let's say, cultural advancement. Jose Felipe Del-Pan was a person. Also, I have to say that he was a very hardworking individual. No? If you look at his list of publications, was amazing, and he touches so many different topics. And I would like also to mention that he did not only translate, he also published classics of Spanish literature in the pages of La Oceanía Española. He published, for example, works of Lope de Vega, he published works from Alarcón, and also from Calderón de la Barca. And regarding his historical novels, it would be interesting to compare his historical novels with the collection by Ricardo Palma. Ricardo Palma was a Peruvian writer. The most famous, actually, is a classic in Peruvian literature, and he was publishing a series of books titled Tradiciones Peruanas, no? Peruvian Traditions. I suspect that Jose Felipe Del-Pan, when he was doing his historical novels, he was somehow imitating this trend, because Ricardo Palma was completely a bestseller at that time. I mean, in the Spanish-speaking world, Ricardo Palma was extremely famous. So again, I think the book of Dr. Dizon is important, but also I believe that still we can go deeper. I mean, and in that sense, we can go deeper not only to know about the works of Jose Felipe Del-Pan, but also to understand better that period. So let's say from 1865 until 1898, I think it's a period about which we can still research a lot to understand the birth of Philippine studies and the search for Filipino identity, both by Spaniards living here and also by Filipinos. For example, there are many other authors in the same period, apart of Jose Felipe Del-Pan, who truly empathize with the Filipino people, no? Like Francisco de Paula Entrala, for example. No? So again, I think this is a very important book. Also, it's a book that is very entertaining to read, which is a virtue, because scholarly books are not always nice to read. And the chapters are well divided, and to be honest, in my case, in a personal case, it stimulates my curiosity to go deeper, no, to know more, to understand better. So again, Dr. Lison, congratulations for this publication, and I think it's a very important book. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Moharo, for that enlightening review from the side of literature. So we have Dr. Torres, who shared to us the historical aspect, and then Dr. and Professor Moharo the contribution of Del-Pan in the advancement and development of Philippine literary studies, and of course the literature. No? And I think Professor Moharo, um, Jose Felipe Del-Pan was also interested in reprinting the famous Filipino work by Francisco Balagtas, Florante at Laura. Unfortunately, it did not push through because maybe Dr. Dizon can enlighten us, because Del-Pan was a firm believer of the quality, the value to Filipinos of that literary work of Balagtas. So thank you very much, Professor Moharo, for your time and wisdom you shared. So and we will now proceed to the message or the remarks of the author. Our author, Dr. Lino Lennon Dizon, when I was still part of the Center for Kapampangan Studies of Holy Angel University a decade ago, he always told me this wisdom and some sort of ethics in cultural studies. He said, do not ask the family owners or the community their photographs or any items belonging to them. Just copy or scan or take photographs, and instead teach them to value those items unless they willfully give it to you. And only to find out that that wisdom was derived by him from Del-Pan. So Del-Pan was already teaching the young scholars of his time, Ponce, De los Reyes, to this ethics of maybe some sort of cultural mapping more than a century ago, that do not take those items, do not ask for them. So, and that was a wisdom from Del-Pan, shared to me by Dr. Dizon, my mentor. And our author is presently a commissioner of the National Historical Commission of the Philippines from 2020 to 2023, and a current ex-econ member of the National Commission for Culture and the Arts, National Committee for Historical Research from 2020 to 2022, representing Luzon. Until his retirement beginning March 1 of this year, he was the Dr. Lee Yelik Alex Professor in Social Sciences, and he was also the Social Sciences and Professor 6 full professor of Tarlac State University, and was the head of its Center for Tarlaceño Studies. He was also a consultant. He's also a consultant, rather, of the Juan D. Nepomuceno Center for Kapampangan Studies of Holy Angel University, and he holds a PhD Philippine Studies from the University of the Philippines, Diliman. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Lino Lennon Dizon.
Salamat. Maraming salamat sa kababayan ko, si Ian Alfonso, na kasama ko na ngayon sa NHCP. So I'm very happy for my NHCP family headed by our father, our chair, Dr. Rene Escalante, for even in this pandemic time, for helping us in commemorating the bicentenary of Jose Felipe Del-Pan and making it part as of the NQC activities for this year. So even with limited time, my NHCP family took overtime, just to be able to produce or reproduce this Del-Pan book. So I am especially thankful for the young blood, the young turks of NHCP with the publication division and others, for really working overtime just to be able to produce this book in time for the birth bicentenary of Jose Felipe Del-Pan. And I'm very happy that it was introduced, aside from our chairman, by Director Javier Galban. I will have to take note here that the first preliminary study I was able to do on Jose Felipe Del-Pan, entitled then Life and Labor of Jose Felipe Del-Pan, was under the auspices of the Spanish Program for Cultural Cooperation, and it was approved by the chair then, Director Javier Galban. So I am really very thankful for the Spanish Program for Cultural Cooperation for giving me that opportunity in 2005 to research on Jose Felipe Del-Pan, and eventually, of course, I integrated this. As I was reading along, I found out that we could really establish Nascent Philippine studies in his works, which eventually became my dissertation. And then the Spanish Program for Cultural Cooperation again supported me in having it published in 2009. So commemorations are the nourishments in the sustenance of the historical memory of an entity like the Filipino nation. Through them, as an anniversary of a birth, death, or an auspicious event, the enthusiasm for history are rekindled and sustained. Ian, pwede akong mag-share screen?
Yes, Commissioner Dizon, you may. So this year of 2021, in the annals of the Philippines, there is something in the offing, the National Quincentennial Commemorations, or the NQC. Through commemorations, says Dr. Rene R. Escalante, our energetic chair of the National Historical Commission of the Philippines, and the NQC Executive Director, in a recent unveiling of a marker, we are in communion with those who have gone before us, even as far as 1521. So it is in that undertaking that they have integrated, my NHCP family have integrated this Spanish scholar who took interest in the Filipino past. So it is so beneficent that through NHCP and the NQC, the working committee decided to include in its itinerary the birth bicentenary of Jose Felipe Del-Pan as a champion of Nascent Philippine Studies and Filipino scholarship. So from 26 May 1891 to his death, to 26 May 2021. With the commemoration is the reprinting of this book about Jose Felipe Del-Pan, first published in 2009 by the Spanish Program for Cultural Cooperation and our Center for Television Studies of Tarlac State University, which is now out of print. So as a grateful author, I acknowledge the concordance of the NHCP to have it reprinted to sustain the aims and objectives of its NQC. So let me share something about the book. Actually, that is the foreword which I shared in the reprint of the book, which according to Ian, you can buy it for 300 pesos. So Rizal
and the groundwork Philippine studies. In my studies on Philippine studies, we all know that we can trace it in 1889, no? Kanya nga yung adika ng Pilipinas, the adika ng Pilipinas is commemorating, no, its birth with the anniversary in 1989 when Rizal initiated the groundwork for Philippine studies. So these were his entries, no? He divided Philippine studies into at least 4 parts, no? Philippine archipelago before the coming of the Spaniards in 1521, arrival of the Spaniards until the loss of Philippine independence, and the takeover by Spain in 1521 to 1808. And then part 3, incorporation of the Philippines in the Spanish nation until the Cavite Mutiny, 1880 to 1872, and then linguistics. No? So these were actually in French, no? Because Rizal was anticipating that he could integrate this conference, no, as part of the program of the Paris Exposition in 1899, no? But of course, he did not pursue. So it is interesting to note that even before, we have already a platform for Philippine studies initiated by Don Jose Felipe Del-Pan, acknowledged as the Decano de la Prensa de Filipinas. So, is one of his protege, no? One of his mentee was Wenceslao Retana in his Aparato Bibliográfico published in 1906, no? Almost 2 decades after the death of Jose Felipe Del-Pan. He said, no? I will just share my translation. It is for this reason that the revista aspired to fill up a true vacuum. He was, of course, referring to the Revista de Filipinas, no, which Del-Pan put up with his publishers, no, Ramirez y Heraudier, that it came to represent in the arena of the press the scientific literary movement, propagating knowledge in ethnography, geology, history, statistics, botany, etc. All of them Filipino. The revista lasted only for 2 years in spite of its efforts to take deeper roots. And then Ratana would be writing again in his Noticias Histórico-Bibliográficas de El Teatro en Filipinas desde sus orígenes hasta 1898. It would not be fair if I were to end up without alluding to the memory of Don Jose Felipe Del-Pan, Galician, prestigious journalist who in the many years he lived in the Philippines around 40, accorded always a genuine affection for that country whose intellectual development he was zealous for. And then one of the students or the mentee of Jose Felipe Del-Pan was, of course, Isabelo F. de los Reyes, who would be writing in his book, La Religión Antigua de los Filipinos, published in 1909. In the same manner, Naning or Mariano Ponce, the late Juan Caro y Mora, and the undersigned would employ our literary skills by writing verses and flowery narrations about love in La Oceania Española. But each director, our unforgettable teacher, Nuestro Inolvidable Maestro, no? Which is our theme for this launching, Don Jose Felipe Del-Pan would oppose it, saying that we were losing precious time, which could be used in writing articles on folklore or popular knowledge more clearly to collect such stories from old women and maids. Let us wake up from all our dreams and ambitions of being so absorbed in Sorilla or even Perez S. Cris with all his flowery verses. So, these were actually the categories of Nascent Philippine Studies in Del-Pan as early as 1875, which we could see again in Rizal in 1889. No? So these were on history, biography, and politics, statistics and public administration, natural history and ethnography and the traditions, customs, descriptions, and domestic travels, agriculture, industry, and commerce, hygiene and medicine, literature, and bibliography. So these were the categories he established in the Revista de Filipinas in 1875. No? And then there were so many books about the Philippines that Del-Pan had various roles. No? The book by Tomas de Comín, Progresos en 70 años, Un viaje a las Islas de Filipinas, which is his English translation of the travel of Dr. John Bowring. No? And then, of course, we have his monumental review, no? The Revista de Filipinas. So, of course, chapter 2 deals with Un Gallego, the one from Galicia, no? Which is the Mundo Español of Jose Felipe Del-Pan, and his cultural preparation. No? So, chapter 3 is about the early life in the Philippines. And so I am referring to Del-Pan as a Renaissance man. No? Del-Pan in the context of mid-19th century Philippine society and culture and the socio-cultural preparation of Jose Felipe Del-Pan. So Del-Pan and travel narratives in the Philippines, Del-Pan and early biographical writing in the Philippines. No? So I pictured here Del-Pan's first leg of his Aventurero trail, no? From Divisoria, Tondo to Baliwag, Bulacan, Baliwag to Kalumpit. No? So Del-Pan was very detailed on his travel, which is actually, he was considering it as the adventure, no? A philosophical adventure in knowing about the Philippine background outside of the walls of Manila. So this, again, Del-Pan was very detailed on his Upper Pampanga trail, no? From Kalumpit, Bulacan until Capas, no? Alta Pampanga, this is a map from Fray Emmanuel Blanco, no? So another early map of Bulacan showing the Dam Castilla, or the old route taken by Del-Pan. No? Of course, Del-Pan would be writing a very interesting story. No? It's like a novel on the saintly Fray Juan Perez de Santa Lucia, who a particular from Padre Juan, no? Condemning attacks on the Aitas and archived by Del-Pan. No? So in the National Archive, you can see it there, no? That this particular, the appeal of Fray Juan Perez de Santa Lucia for the colonial government, for the government to do something on the plight of the Aitas, you can see it archived in the National Archives of the Philippines, and it was Del-Pan who archived it, no? For Fray Juan Perez de Santa Lucia. So, of course, Del-Pan's publisher, Hero Deer, no? Would be printing, no? In the Ilustración Filipina, no? So very important in the history of publishing in the Philippines. And then some of the co-writers and co-scholars of Del-Pan at that time, like Sebastian Vidal, no, would already be studying about the indigenous groups as early as 1860s, no? And then, of course, another interesting phase in the life of Del-Pan would be the long and winding life of a journalist, no? He would be very important, no, in newspaper publishing in the Philippines, as he was being considered as the Decano de la Prensa de Filipinas. He would be working for the resuscitated Diario de Manila from 1860 to 1877. He would be the editor of the Revista de Filipinas, and eventually he would be establishing his own publishing firm, La Oceania Española. So, the first issue of the resurrected Diario de Manila was September 1, 1860. It was a very progressive newspaper at that time, no? And Del-Pan then has the blessing as the cabinet secretary, as the Governor General Secretary of General Ramon Solano. Unfortunately, only I think a week in the office, Ramon Solano, a progressive governor general, had an untimely death. No, there were chismes then that he was poisoned, no, by the friars, no, because of his libertarian movement that included the establishment of the public school. No, Del-Pan was the cabinet secretary, was the colonial secretary responsible, no, for the decree on the public education in 1863. No, so these were some of his outputs when he was the first editor of the resurrected Diario de Manila in September 1, 1860. And then, under the Diario de Manila, under his publisher, no, Manuel Ramirez y Baltasar Hero J., he was responsible for this Vista de Filipinas, for this Estado, this important economic book, no, by Tomas de Comín, and then of course the visit, the travelogue, no, the travel book by Sir John Bowring, which Del-Pan translated in Spanish for the readers. It was also in the Revista de Filipinas where we can find out, for example, that the first Spanish edition, no, I am saying it now, the first Spanish edition of the Pigapetta Travel, no, the first Spanish translation was actually done by Del-Pan in 1875. No? Actually, some scholars were citing the Spanish rendition of Jose Toribio Medina, this Peruvian bibliographer, no, to be the first Spanish translation on Pigapetta. But no, I find out that as early as 1875, Del-Pan already did a translation for the Spanish reader of the Pagapeta account, no, which is very important in our NQC celebrations, no. And then, of course, these are the publications of the La Oceania Española, this about the Ferrocarril, about Los Chinos and Filipinas, no. All of these were outputs of Del-Pan, no. And then, of course, as shared by Professor Jorge, the literary works of Don Jose Felipe Del-Pan. No? So these were Del-Pan as a literature. No? So these were some of his outputs which were actually read, no, by Professor Jorge, Hay Huerta de Amor, The Rest of the Paquita, Cinco Horas en el Limbo, 10 Millones. These are actually historical novels, no? And actually, it is said that the first novel, no, Un Naufrago, Isla de la Cruz de Barca, which is actually a novel on utopia, no? Del-Pan was saying he was inspired by St. Thomas More, no? So he was actually contemplating on having a classless society, no? Something for the Philippines to adopt, no? So it was communism in theme, no? The first novel, no? A literary scholar, Hernandez Chung, considered this to be the first novel published in the Philippines, no? And then Idilio Entre Sampaguitas, Ni Canto, Ni Aroma, Ni Amor, no? Because the Spaniards were saying that when you go to the Philippines, there is no song, the flower does not have smell, and then of course the women do not have love, no? Which a fellow Spaniard like Del-Pan contradicted. No? Then of course it's important. El Médico de su Honra, he was actually he was actually following a theme by a drama by de la Barca, no, on this unfortunate on the unfortunate story, no, El Médico de su Honra, which Del-Pan followed and made into a drama. This was the tragic life of Governor General Alonso Fajardo and the killing of his wife, no. And so he patterned it after his story, no? El Médico de su honra by the Spanish, no? Calderón de la Barca. And then, of course, it's interesting, Viaje al País de los Aitas, no? His travel to the Upper Pampanga area. So, of course, Del-Pan was a critic of, he was after the buen gobierno, no? He was for the vida práctica de Filipinas, no? He was actually interino colonial secretary, his punto de vista on education in the Philippines, political reforms and developments, and then, of course, for the vida práctica de Filipinas, no? So these were some of his outputs: Diccionario de la Administración del Comercio, por la vida práctica de Filipinas, and then study on population. He was among the first to study statistics on the population, no? And then, of course, it is very timely that we will honor Del-Pan and his Manila, no? He became actually a member of the Cabildo, and then as an alcalde of the Ayuntamiento, no? So he was saying that the Manila of 1853 and 1844, without promenades, without theaters, without newspapers, without places for public meetings, and with 1/5 of the people from all classes that we have today, was a sad residence for persons who never savored the pleasure of unrestrained gossiping as an habitual pastime. So Del-Pan was so much after the development of Manila to be free from the chismis, no, of the people who are not doing anything, no, for the economic progress. So, of course, his legacy for the city of Manila would be, of course, the Diario de Manila, no? So the editors believe that they are performing the duty that they are asserting right at this moment, where they thrill with authority all the obstacles, giving in the Diario de Manila a dignified newspaper of the capital with a name that it will be proud of. In Philippine literary history, this will be very important because it was at this time that there was strict censorship, no? So with Del-Pan taking hold of the Diario de Manila, there was somehow an expression of progressive ideas, no? And then, of course, Idilio Entre Sampaguitas deals with Manila, no? Some of the catastrophes that affected Manila, like earthquake, like typhoons, etc., no? Of course, Del-Pan is a social scientist. He works on Philippine society and culture. He was the nuestro inolvidable maestro, no? And then, of course, on the beginning of folklore in the Philippines, on early historical investigation in the Philippines, on early studies on population of the Philippines, no? And then on women education and the first Philippine bibliography. So, Del-Pan was actually responsible, no, for early scholars, no, early Filipino scholars who all work on his press, no. On one side we have Isabelo de los Reyes, and then of course we have Pascual Poblete and Mariano Ponce, Anacleto de Rosario, and others. On the other side was Wenceslao Retana, no? So these two groups would be battling it out, no, in the propaganda movement. Both of them were mentees of Jose Felipe Del-Pan, but they would be taking sides, no, taking different sides for the sake of deeper understanding of Philippine society. So when he died in 1894, of course, the Ayuntamiento de Manila named the street. This is the Principe Street in San Nicolas, no, for Del-Pan, no. including a bridge. Unfortunately, some were attributing it to his son, no, Rafael Del-Pan, but it should be corrected, no. We have already discussed it that it should be for Jose Felipe Del-Pan. So again, I am very thankful for our NHCP family, headed by our energetic chair, no, Dr. Rene Escalante, for our reviewers, for Director Javier Galvan, and all those who shared, no, their effort, no, so that we could have something for this, no, in the appreciation of what we call now the Nascent Philippine Studies in the life and labor of Jose Felipe Del-Pan. So, dakal pong salamat, marami pong salamat.
Thank you, Dr. Lino Dizon, our author of the book, Nascent Philippine Studies in the Life and Labor of Jose Felipe Del-Pan, 1821 to 1891. And we will now proceed to the question and answer. So the questions will be directly asked to addressed to Dr. Dizon, and we may and our reviewers may also answer or give their opinions, you know, or their insights to some of the questions. So maybe we can begin first with the simple questions. So, Dr. Dizon, what was Del-Pan's profession?
So Del-Pan started as a colonial. He was appointed by the Spanish colonial government, I think around 1853, but he was able to come in the Philippines around 1855. No, he was really a bureaucrat appointed by the colonial government, and then he would be working in the colonial government under governor generals. No, at least two of them, Ramon Solano, and then Echage, no, Rafael Echage. So these two governor generals were actually responsible for the educational reform decree of 1863, and Del-Pan was then the colonial secretary. When this important decree was approved in 1863, so the Philippines was among the first to have a public school, no, earlier than other countries. And then, of course, he would be working it out as an editor appointed by Imprenta de Ramirez Hiraudier. And I will tell you, Ian, that Imprenta de Ramirez Hiraudier actually was the publisher of the Florante at Laura.
It was published. It was printed.
Yes, it was actually printed by under Del-Pan, no? Imprenta de Ramirez Heraudia, his publishers, who were first appointed, no, as a government publisher for the Diario de Manila. So Diario de Manila started as actually as a government newspaper, but eventually it will be entertaining, no? It will be entertaining, cultural opinions and others, no? So the resuscitated Diario de Manila was started by Del-Pan in 1860. This was the second, no, the resuscitated Diario de, and then of course Del-Pan would be establishing his own film, Oceania Española.
So, Dr. Dizon, would that mean Del-Pan began his journalism profession in the Philippines already, not in Spain? Because most of his years were devoted to journalism. So it began here in the Philippines.
Yeah. As the editor, appointed by Ramirez Heraudier.
Okay. So thank you very much. And the second question, did Rizal meet Del-Pan? Were they instances that they met?
I believe so because it was actually Del-Pan who awarded this Unta Al-Pasig. The play was actually featured by Del-Pan in Oceania Española, and of course we can always follow the life of Jose Rizal in the writings of Del-Pan. First, it was Del-Pan who mentioned the title Noli Me Tangere in Revista de Filipinas. He was actually talking of this his first idea of Noli Me Tangere were those authorities without authority, those unschooled personalities who were sharing their opinion. So it was my suspect that Noli Me Tangere was actually after Philosopher Tasio, where the philosopher without actual educational background will be sharing something, which is not advocated by Del-Pan, without proper education. And then, of course, it was Del-Pan who mentioned that it was actually his criticism on Antonio de Morga. He was saying that there is an English translation of the book available at the London, at the British Library of London. So again, Rizal would be following this lead, Revista de Filipinas. And then it was Del-Pan who his study of the will of a woman of Kalumpit as a suitable model for education. Rizal would be following it with the letters to the young women of Malolos. So, and then it was Del-Pan who challenged the Filipino youth in Revista de Filipinas, to ship away, from dreams, but to take appreciation of the sciences and the arts, and then this became the Rizal, the Filipino youth, poem of Jose Rizal. You can see all of this in the Revista de Filipinas. And this was published in 1875, By that time, Rizal was already in University of Santo Tomas, around 1875, when Revista de Filipinas came out. So it's he was calling him my friend, He was telling Blumentritt that itong matandang Del-Pan, this old Del-Pan was actually his friend.
Okay. So thank you very much, Dr. Dizon. I'm just recalling where did I read this. One of the inspiration of Rizal in creating the character of Ben Zayib in his novel was Del-Pan. I'm not sure if Professor Moharo can or Dr. Dizon, Dr. Torres can enlighten on that. So I'm just recalling if I read it in Leon Mira Guerrero's First Filipino. Ben Zayib was likened or derived from the character of Del-Pan. I'm not sure. So, and where are Del-Pan's direct descendants? Well, they repatriated to Spain after the Philippine Revolution. So the third question, Dr. Dizon, is on the Del-Pan's immediate family, where they repatriated back to Spain after the Philippine Revolution.
So I think Professor Jorge can say something about Ben Saib and this journalist.
To be honest, I have no idea. I cannot. Sorry.
Thank you,
So,
Professor.
It is my idea, Ian, that Rizal was actually criticizing the non-progressive journalists, like Kanyamake or Kyokyap, Pablo Pejer, and then of course Vicente Barantes. Rizal was very critical of Barantes, and so I believe he was referring to this journalist, and not really Del-Pan, because when Del-Pan, in the account of Del-Pan, they were saying that revolutionaries were actually preserving his tomb, at the La Loma Cemetery during the revolution, no? Because they were saying that his ideas, no, were very important to them. So there are accounts, no, which I just got later, that revolutionaries were actually saving the tomb of Del-Pan from being bombed, no, by the revolution, no, because of his important contributions to them, no. Actually, for some time, when Principe Street was as Del-Pan Street, some reactionaries were not really, were not amenable that somebody as progressive as Del-Pan would be that Principe Street would be renamed as Del-Pan Street, since Del-Pan was viewed as progressive.
Dr. Dizon, you mentioned the role of the Philippine revolutionaries in protecting the tomb of Del-Pan. Actually, the fourth question is related to that. Where was Del-Pan buried?
At La Loma Cemetery.
Ay, La Loma.
Actually, last time, Ian, we were able to contact the family, no, of Del-Pan. I think they are with the RJ Del-Pan, I think, no, RJ Del-Pan Insurance, in shipping. But I cannot contact them now, no. I am trying to contact them. They were present during the launching in 2009, but I cannot contact the family now. These were the direct descendants of Rafael Del-Pan. No, I think this RJ Del-Pan shipping something, no, near NHCP.
So they stayed in the Philippines even after the Philippine Revolution.
At least this Rafael Del-Pan line, no, are still in the Philippines, I think, no.
Rafael Del-Pan was quite one of the notable journalists, during the early American period, and one of the friends of Rizal and Mabini, etc.
Yeah.
So how was he
after
Del-Pan?
He is the son, no?
Okay, he was a son of Del-Pan. Okay.
Del-Pan. So Filipinos in history, this NHCP NSI publication was actually referring to the street after Rafael Del-Pan, which is not supposed to be, and which we need to correct, no? So Rafael Del-Pan is the son of Jose Felipe Del-Pan.
So you mentioned about the street. So the next question is, was Del-Pan Bridge named after him? Del-Pan Bridge in Tondo.
Del-Pan Street and Del-Pan Bridge in 1894, no?
Okay, so Del-Pan Bridge was named after Jose Felipe Del-Pan, not to the son. Okay, so and the next question is, was Del-Pan happened to visit the Visayas and Mindanao, or made any reference to the Visayans or the Muslim Mindanao?
Yeah, you can see his notes, no, on Mindanao in his annotation of Tomas de Comín. No? You can see his many annotation on Visayas and Mindanao in his annotation of Tomas de Comín's book.
Actually, we have a question here in our webinar box, in our comment box, from Mr. Raymar Tabalao from Lake Cebu Tourism. Actually, he is asking where can he access this book entitled Islas Filipinas, authored by Jose Felipe Del-Pan. Maybe this is the annotation.
Yeah,
Tomas de Comín. Okay, so by Tomas de Comín.
It is available online. Under BNE, I think, the Biblioteca Nacional
de España.
It is available. You can download it. No, this Progress in the Philippines, no, by Tomas de Comín.
Okay, so just a clarification from one of our webinar attendees, Mr. Raymar Tabalao, Islas Filipinas was not authored by Del-Pan, but he annotated it. The actual author is Tomas de Comin.
Thomas De Comin.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So actually, there is also a question here related to Tomas de Comin. There were Spanish scholars like Tomas de Comin who wrote critically on Spanish colonial policies. Did Del-Pan made the same criticism on the colonial government? And then he has a follow-up question: did he support the reform movement?
Yeah. Of course, the intention of Del-Pan was to share this very important, no, which is this very important book by Tomas de Comin, no, which is on the state of the Philippines in 1810, which was then out of print. So by having it reprinted is already a manifestation that he was after reform, no, in the economic and the colonial administration of the Philippines, no. And then, of course, we can see, that with this support of the career of Isabella de Rosales, Mariano Ponce, who became stalwarts of the propaganda movement, then we could really say that Del-Pan contributed to the scholarly development of many reformists.
Okay, another question from our webinar from our webinar attendees from Mr. Kyle Andre Ibones from Cebu Normal University. Philippine history in school curriculums have long been recognizing historical scholars such as Tabera, Paterno, and Ponce, but too minimal has been given to the life and contributions of Del-Pan. What do you think is the reason why there is less recognition of Del-Pan in general history curriculums for students?
So I think it is just, I really cannot comment if it is part of the nationalist tradition, but you can see the comment, no, of such scholars like Florentino, Hornedo, Father Schumacher, no, that this scholarly, that the scholarly agenda of the propaganda movement was indeed, no, created by the progressive ideas of some Spaniards or Creole in the Philippines, no. And so, for example, they were citing, no, with the Cavite Mutiny of 1872 was actually instigated by a group, no, of Creole or Spanish writers in the Philippines, no, with their progressive ideas, no.
Okay, and I think that is somewhat connected to the next question from Mr. John Marion Caponitan from Calamba, Laguna. You already answered this, Dr. Dizon, that in your opinion, it is the lack of recognition to Del-Pan is a product of the nationalist historiography, you know. So okay, so and actually, okay.
Ian, although with the, with actually Benedict Anderson in his study on Isabella de Rosales did not mention, no, Del-Pan. He was only saying the Spanish mentor, no, but William Henry Scott, no, already attributed the scholar, the scholar, let us say, the scholarly career of Isabella de los Reyes under Del-Pan.
If I may add also, yes. If I may add also, Dr. Dizon, supposedly National Artist for Literature Rizal Mojares is giving his review, and one of his notable books, The Brains of the Nation, he also acknowledged Del-Pan among the Spaniards who helped steering or instigating the interest of this generation of Rizal to Philippine studies. So, and related to those questions, Dr. Dizon, it has been noted that Del-Pan began the Philippine studies often attributed to either Rizal's colleagues and the Americans. What was the reactions of Filipino scholars to your work that Del-Pan was the forerunner of Philippine studies? Did you encounter any eye I mean eyebrow tawag dito, tinaasan ka ba ng kilay sa dissertation mo, Doc, o whatever, no?
I have a very critical panel for my dissertation, and of course my advisor was the founding president of the Adika ng Pilipinas, which started each organization with the 1889 Goal for Philippine Studies by Rizal in Paris, 1889. So I will have to convince Dr. Veneracion, that as early as 1875, we already have this platform for Philippine studies, which were not yet, which were conceived later by Dr. Jose Rizal, and we could really see a pattern, that the categories used by Del-Pan would be more or less the same categories to be used by Rizal in the founding of Philippine studies in 1889.
Okay, so maybe this second to the last question, we can address this also to Professor Moharo and Dr. Victor Torres. So the next question is, were there any Spaniards like Del-Pan who studied the Filipino culture with utmost respect and regard to Filipinos? So maybe siguro this question, he wants to imply that were there any Spaniards like Del-Pan who viewed Philippine history, culture, society with some kind of less prejudices. Maybe we can hear first from Dr. Moharo, Professor Moharo.
Yes, there were actually many, and most of them, I believe, they were working in the newspapers directed by Del-Pan, right? And probably one of the few reactionaries that Del-Pan admitted was actually Retana, no? Because, I mean, probably Del-Pan did not know the political, tendency of Retana. But I think most of the people who work under Del-Pan were actually progressive, no? And actually, for example, we can mention Francisco de Paula Entrala, who published Olvidos de Filipinas, no? Like Oblivions of the Philippines, where he actually defended the Philippines against the biases and misunderstandings and prejudices of Francisco Cañamaque, right?
Cañamaque, yes.
Yeah, so yes, there were, I think the nationalist historiography tends to portray all the Spaniards as necessarily conservative, reactionary, but actually there were a lot of liberals. And I would say this 50%. If you look at the authors at that time, you can see that 50% were actually very supportive of Philippines' aspirations. Let's say maybe he did not consider independence. At least they were very supportive. And then we have another 50% who were more or less conservative, and they were very staunch patriots. No. But if you look at the bibliography, the books published and at the end of 19th century in the Philippines, you would see you can see clearly that there are two tendencies. No, the most liberal authors, very supportive of the Philippines' wishes and desires, and people who is very constructive and giving ideas on how to improve the archipelago. And then we have other ones who are actually not so friendly, let's say.
Okay, Dr. Torres, any insights about the question?
Yeah, basically, I agree with Dr. Moharo, because the number one person that comes to mind was really Retana, because he was the one who would write these things about Philippine history, Philippine culture. But of course, there was still that taint of biases, and that's still a taint of biases and everything. I would probably also like to think that that Rizal was writing in support of the attitude of some of the Spaniards in Spain who were against reforms here in the Philippines. And well, although he has an impressive collection of work, no, he probably also like some journalists here is that they would write with a certain principle in mind. I mean the Spanish newspapers of that era were of course were heavily opinionated, and it is this attitude that would, as Dr. Mohara said, no, that would bring about two sides of the coin: the ones who were supportive and the ones who were not supportive. A classic example I would always like to point out was the work El Teatro Tagalog by Vicente Barantes, who would eventually point out that there was no theater in the Philippines during the pre-colonial era and everything. And this kind of thinking, unfortunately, would stay with us for quite a while until it was only two later Philippine studies by Filipino cultural artists and cultural and history writers, that they would realize that these writers were working with European standards. That does not measure at all with that of the Philippines. But the irony of this was that Jose Rizal was already looking at this kind of thing that you're looking at a Filipino culture that you're measuring to your standards. He was telling Spain, what we have is so totally different from yours. And I think this was the very idea that Del-Pan was putting in his works. So that I am here, you are there, and I have the first person observation of what the Philippines is like, not you. No, unfortunately, of course, as Dr. Mohara said, Retala was among the staff also, and he was creating a certain quote unquote rift with regards to opinions with the writings about the Philippines.
Maybe with the indulgence of Dr. Dizon, there is a special question from the Central Office of NHCP. Maybe we can address this to Dr. Torres, being a descendant of one of the ambassadors of the first Philippine Republic abroad, Heriberto Sarcal. So this question came from Eufemio Agbayani, our colleague in the NHCP Central Office. Good morning. Is it proper to say that Del-Pan's concern for Filipino culture and society inspired his son Rafael to join the Philippine Diplomatic Corps during the revolution?
Well, first of all, probably in my case, in the case of my great grandfather, this wasn't at first bound yet with anything cultural or anything. Remember, diplomacy sometimes comes first and foremost with politics, and the recognition of the Philippine government was the purpose or the mission, of course, of the Aguinaldo government when it started appointing its plenipotentiaries. No? I would, however, like to think that probably much later, when the diplomatic corps of the Philippines was already being formed, that Del-Pan was joining because he was realizing that the second purpose, of course, of having a diplomatic corps was to make known the history and culture of the nation you are representing.
Thank you, Dr. Torres. Yes po, Dr. Dizon.
I will just add something. Later, Rafael would become the publisher, no? And the director of the Oceania Española, and he would become a bitter enemy of Retana later, no? So this could be a factor why Rafael Del-Pan became progressive, even joining the Aguinaldo government. And later, he would be founding the Nacionalista Party, no? Which is for the independence of the Philippines from the United States, no? So that was the platform of Rafael Del-Pan.
And Rafael Del-Pan was responsible for having for presenting the Mi Ultimo Adios of Rizal to what they call this American representative who read this in the House of Representatives, proving that the Filipinos were not barbaric, savages, and worthy of autonomy. I forgot the name of that American representative, whom Del-Pan.
I think Charles Jennings Bryan, something. Charles Jennings Bryan.
Yes. And it was translated by Derbyshire eventually. So maybe this last question, maybe with the indulgence also of Dr. Dison, maybe Professor Moharo can answer this. Were there any works aside from this book of Del-Pan about the unknown Spaniards who helped constructing Filipino history and culture during the generation of Rizal? Were there any references we can read about the other Spaniards, the unknown Spaniards, who helped Rizal and his generation reconstruct Philippine history?
Well, that's a that's a difficult question. I mean, I think many of the people who actually helped Rizal were not actually in the Philippines. They were in Spain, like for example, Moraita, right? So it was more difficult to be found here. Why? Because there was more censorship in the Philippines. This is something that Antonio Luna criticized in La Solidaridad. He said that one of the ironies is it was easier to publish things with freedom in Madrid or in Barcelona, actually, than in Manila. Because in Manila, every single book and even the newspapers were censored. And they were censored by the friars and also by the civil government. So it wasn't an easy task. And however, if they could find friends here, we cannot trace it because we don't find the sources unless we find letters, right? However, in Spain, it is easy to trace which are the liberal friends, the ones who were supporting La Solidaridad and other publications. They were supporting Marcelo del Pilar and López Jaena, right? Because paradoxically, there was more freedom there and here, right? But I remember that one of those that were very supportive of the Philippine cause, even for the independence, was Moraita, actually.
Ian, can I add something?
Yes, Dr. Vic.
Yeah, some writers who eventually would write about the Philippines while in the Philippines, Spanish writers. Some things would come to mind, and I think you can probably check the list of what the writers of Ilustración Filipina and the other Spanish publications that arrived here, that were printed here. One of the, I think, prominent who wrote a lot about history and culture and, of course, travel, and I don't know who influenced it, was Felipe de Guvantes, who wrote a series of articles in Ilustración Filipina. And there were some who, unfortunately, and this is, I think, the problem, as Dr. Mahar would point out, that some of them were using pen names and some of them were just using aliases, and not probably out of fright, because that's a common tactic sometimes being used by a lot of writers. And it would take real studies to work on it, to check who were these writers really. No? But one thing comes to mind, and I think probably work could be done about him, was Felipe de Guvantes. Because he really had a series of articles that he wrote about Manila and the provinces. No? But as I said, I'm not sure how long that he stayed as a journalist. No? And he would eventually also write the history of the Philippines. That would be part of the, if I remember it right, the textbook of the University of Santo Tomas. That would be used by the friars, no? And the writings of what he did was pretty much neutral, because he was writing as an observer, and he wasn't writing with much biases that would always come to mind.
Okay, maybe this calls for another more Hispanic than we admit by Professor Moharo. Okay. Anyway, thank you very much, Dr. Dizon, Professor Mojaro, and Dr. Torres for answering the questions. Although there are still more questions in the pipeline, but we need to cut this event because it's already 12 noon. So, and maybe we can is Sir Alvin Alcid, our Deputy Executive Director for Programs and Projects, is still here. Actually,
yes, Ian.
yes, opo. And opo, Dr. Chairman Rene pala, nandito pa rin po si Chairman Rene. Also, we also have here Dr. Neil Marshall Santillan. I saw him among the participants in the webinar. Dr. Neil of the History Department of UP. Thank you very much for gracing this event. So to give us the parting words or the closing remarks, may I have Sir Alvin Alcid. Then also, Sir Alvin, kindly answer one of the questions. Bakit ang mura-mura daw ng libro ng NHCP?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ian. Am I in already?
Yes po, Sir Alvin.
Thank you, Ian. In behalf of the NHCP, would like to thank everyone who joined us today, this morning. Of course, we would like to congratulate, of course, Dr. Dino Dizon, our commissioner, to all our panelists, Professor Mojaro, Dr. Victores, to those who speak earlier, Chairman Escalante, of course, and Senor Galban, and everyone who joined us. Thank you for joining us, and expect more publications from the National Quincentennial Committee to come up in the coming months. With regards to that question, before we close, the reason it's very, I would say, affordable is that because we are a government agency, we actually cover only in the printing cost. We only try to recoup the printing cost. Now, we don't really intend to generate income from this publication because the mandate of the National Historical Commission and the Quincentennial Commemoration of the Philippines is to educate, to use social media, to use publications to further enhance or propagate the study of Philippine history. So again, in behalf of the NHCP, would like to thank everyone. Magandang umaga po sa inyong lahat, and have a good day ahead.
So, family picture. Yes po. Yes po. Thank you po, Dr. Sir Alvin Alcid. So before we end, can we have a posterity shot as requested by Chairman Rene? Okay. So Alex,
nice meeting you online, Jorge.
Yes. So,
Alex.
Ayan. So Commissioner Cleope, Architect Lita, Ma'am Gina, ayan. And also we have also here Sir Louis Bartolo, one of the also a mentee of Dr. Dizon from Magalang, one of the historians from Pampanga. So can we si Dr. Cleope, pwede po ba nating ma-on ang video? So okay, Alec, kindly cue us. Okay, salamat po. So
thank you very much.
So this concludes, yes, okay. So this concludes the a simple commemoration to the birth bicentenary of Jose Felipe Del-Pan. Today we are enlightened of how our heroes like Rizal began their studies on Philippine history, culture, and society through the materials Del-Pan had reprinted while they were growing. He treated Filipino culture, especially the Tekbalang, Aswang, Nuno, and other folk beliefs, worthy of appreciation and documentation, inspiring young journalists and scholars in the late 19th century to instigate Filipinos' interest to their own cultural heritage. Again, I enjoin each and everyone to please support this book by Dr. Dino Dizon. It will enrich our understanding who we are as a people, our being and becoming. The selling price is just 300 pesos. Thank you very much and magandang umaga po sa ating lahat.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Buenos días.
Bye-bye.
Congratulations. Gracias. Enhorabuena.
Gracias.
Salamat po. Congrats, Dr. Dizon.
Congratulations po. Ingat po.
Salamat, Alec. Director Galvan.
Dirigmang Pilipinas